watching Reason and Theology Live. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
All right, y'all should be able to hear me now. I apologize for the no audio there, and thank you for letting me know there in the chat. Wouldn't want to have another one of those repeats where I go 30 minutes without realizing that I'm on mute the whole time. So what happens is the soundboard that I use for the microphone occasionally switches on the platform that I use, and it switches to the video switcher that I have, which has no audio. And I don't know why the microphone source will occasionally switch from my soundboard to the video switcher. I no idea. But it's like the settings occasionally reset. And so that's effectively what happened. Well, welcome to the show. What we're doing is going to review a video here by Taylor Marshall, at least 2 minutes of it, but y'all know me, we can spend a good 20 minutes reviewing 2 minutes worth of material, and it's going to be in relation to a couple comments that he made about the Second Vatican Council and also the Council of Florence on the question of limbo. Now, you've probably heard me address some of these issues before, but it seems like Dr. Taylor Marshall is continuing to spread this misinformation. And there's a lot of people who are new to the channel, so this will be new information for a lot of people. But for those of y'all who are, nuancers that go back to the original days, you've probably heard some of these things before, and so you'll immediately recognize the problems and the misinformation that Taylor Marshall continues to spread and confuse people with. I don't know what his intentions are. I'm not judging his intentions. Maybe he's well-intentioned in spreading this misinformation. I'm not trying to judge that. I'm simply judging what he says. That's all I'm judging. Objectively, what he's saying is false, and that's all I'm trying to engage. Again, I'm not trying to read his heart or say that he's intentionally trying to deceive. I can say he does know better or has had the opportunity to know better, but for some reason he continues to spread this misinformation that is factually one can demonstrate rather easily that he's factually mistaken, but the information that he's spreading is also very harmful to people. So this misinformation is not without consequence. It actually will end up undermining the church and its reliability when it comes to its magisterium, its teaching authority. All right, so that's enough by way of introduction. Let's go ahead and watch the clips, and I will address the two issues again, some of his comments on the Second Vatican Council, and then let's see, the other one is going to be on limbo. And I see here in the chat, Matt Frad just mentioned you and Taylor Marshall on his channel. I haven't heard of that, so I'm not familiar with what he said or anything, but I'll try to take a look if you can send me the timestamp. So all right, let's go ahead and dive in. I'm going to share my screen here. Let me know if y'all can't hear the audio or having difficulties there, and I can reset everything. But okay, you should be able to see Dr. Taylor Marshall's video now. Let's go ahead and dive in. We're at the 10-minute 40-second mark where this is in his video where he's going over Cardinal Supich and some of the implementations that he has recently made liturgically in his own diocese, which I don't really care enough to comment on that particular topic. I just randomly, this came up in my feed. I decided, let me click on it, see what he's saying. And immediately this is what I heard. So I said, okay, I guess we have to address this again. So here we are.
The Second Vatican Council and its liturgical books. Oddly enough, the Second Vatican Council has no canons and no anathemas.
Yeah, so here we are again. It's actually true that the Second Vatican Council has no canons and no anathemas, but that is 100% irrelevant to pretty much any discussion on liturgical reform or Vatican II's teaching authority. It really is absolutely irrelevant. As I've noted before, the Council of Florence, which he's going to bring up ironically here in a moment, itself has no canons and no anathemas. I guess he's not going to put two and two together because his comments here about Vatican II having no canons and anathemas ends up undermining his appeal to the Council of Florence, which itself has no canons and anathemas. It's 100% irrelevant that the Second Vatican Council has no canons and anathemas. Those are helpful in determining whenever the magisterium has employed its definitive teaching, or its definitive ability, I should say, its gift of infallibility, rather. It's helpful in identifying that, but it's, of course, not the only way in which the church can employ its infallibility. It can also do so in professions of faith. It can also do so in the way that it did at the Council of Florence, which again had no anathemas and no canons, yet it does have solemn definitive language in there. And that solemn definitive language is an indicator that, okay, the gift of infallibility is being employed here. So the teaching is definitive. The Second Vatican Council, as I've noted many, many times before, actually does itself employ the gift of infallibility by teaching something definitively that prior to then had not been settled, had not been considered definitive. But of course, where this is coming from is a misunderstanding of something that Paul VI has said. And I've brought that out before, and we're going to have to do so again, because that's where he's going next. So let's continue.
I accept every anathema of Vatican II.
That's just pure rhetoric. Who cares? That again, just because you want to be rhetorical and say, I accept every anathema of Vatican II, and of course there's no anathemas, irrelevant. The question is, do you accept its teachings? Because it does have teachings in there that are not attached, do not have anathemas attached to it, but they still require your assent. And if you do not give your assent, you are in dissent, just like the liberals are when they're in dissent on the teaching of contraception as expressed by Humanae Vitae. You're just as much in dissent as they are. So just to say, well, I accept every teaching here that has an anathema on it. So what? Of course, yeah, it doesn't have any anathemas, but it still does teach. It still does offer doctrinal propositions. And the question is, do you give assent to them? Moreover, it does offer some definitive teachings. You have to give an irrevocable assent to that. So my question is not, do you assent to any of its anathemas? There aren't any anathemas. My question is, do you assent to its teachings? In the same way that I would ask the same question for Florence. Florence doesn't have any anathemas. Does that mean it's a free-for-all? Does that mean it's just a merely pastoral council? No, there are plenty of teachings in it. And in fact, there's definitive teachings in the Council of Florence. My question then is, do you believe those? Do you give assent to them? The same question that I would have to ask for Florence, I'm now having to ask for the Second Vatican Council. And Dr. Marshall refuses to answer this because it seems as if he's not aware that the Second Vatican Council has teachings in it. And if he is aware of it, it seems as if he's not aware that those require religious submission of intellect and will at the very least. And some of its propositions are to be held definitively. So I would like to know, I mean, hey, Dr. Marshall, do you accept Vatican II's teachings? And if not, upon what basis do you reject them? Because you think it's maybe contrary to another proposition taught elsewhere? Well, you're going to have to show me that the propositions taught elsewhere contradict what is taught here by the magisterium, and that they were taught with a greater weight, which of course can't be done. That's not going to happen. Dr. Marshall can't do that because that's simply not the case. So then that means you have to assent to what Vatican II teaches.
And yet, Supich and Pope Francis are enforcing
and somebody says, pretty sure Taylor is just ignoring you, Mike. So sad. He probably is. I mean, I'm asking the question rhetorically. I don't expect Marshall to actually answer. It's clear he's not going to. I'm asking this rhetorically so that you, the viewers, can realize he's not answering the questions that really should be answered, right? He's not engaging the questions that need to be addressed. He's completely avoiding them. And it capitalizes on people who are ignorant about the Second Vatican Council and the magisterium and the way it operates.
Perfect allegiance to a pastoral council.
It's not just a pastoral council. It does have a pastoral emphasis and orientation. And what it meant by that is that it's not going to use anathemas. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have any teachings in it. It's not pastoral as opposed to doctrinal. It's pastoral in the sense of its presentation, but it's presentation of doctrine. Make no mistake, it presents doctrine. It teaches things. There is doctrine in there. It's not merely pastoral.
That even Paul VI said was not infallible.
Yeah, so that's actually not what Paul VI said, as I've demonstrated many times. But let's do so again, because this is a falsehood. What he said is 100% false. Paul VI was a little bit more nuanced than that. So let's examine this together. Here's what Paul VI said. Let me pull it up on my screen. Okay, here we go. There are those who ask what authority, what theological qualification the council intended to give to its teachings. Did you catch that? Teachings. Oh, wait. I thought this was merely pastoral. Okay. Teaching. That should automatically make you think, assent is required. As soon as you hear that, you should be thinking assent is required. Therefore, the question is, Dr. Marshall, do you give assent to these teachings? If not, upon what basis? How are you not in dissent, just as the liberals are when they reject Humanae Vitae? That's going to be the question. All right, but knowing that it avoided issuing solemn, dogmatic definitions, he did not say knowing that it taught nothing infallible, avoided issuing solemn dogmatic definitions engaging the infallibility of the ecclesiastical magisterium. The infallibility of the magisterium can be engaged in two different contexts. He only mentions one of them in relation to dogmas. He does not answer the question, did it perhaps offer the gift of infallibility on Catholic doctrine? Dogmas and doctrine are not the same, although sometimes we use them as synonyms, very technically speaking, when we're speaking about the magisterium. A dogma is something that has been confirmed by the magisterium infallibly, that is in the deposit of faith, that is in scripture or tradition, either explicitly or implicitly. It's called a primary object of infallibility. That is a dogma. But there are also infallible teachings that are not dogmas. They're not in scripture or tradition, but they're so connected to something that's in scripture or tradition that it is eligible to be taught infallibly by the magisterium, such as the illicitness or immorality of the use of artificial contraception. That is not, well, I mean, the church could come out and confirm that it's a dogma, but to my knowledge, it's not a dogma. It's infallibly taught as Catholic doctrine. It's something connected to something that is in the deposit of faith that can't be reversed. I think that the church has infallibly taught the illicitness and immorality of artificial contraception, but not as a dogma, but as Catholic doctrine, right? There are many other examples that can be offered. But just because something is taught as a secondary object of infallibility, as Catholic doctrine, doesn't mean it is somehow less, it deserves less of your assent. It does deserve a different kind of your assent, but it still deserves an irreformed or irrevocable assent. It's something that just simply can't be reversed. And it's based upon the infallibility of the church. So what he's saying, Paul VI is saying, is it never employed its charism of teaching infallibly in relation to dogmas. But then there's two questions that still remain. Number one, well, did it employ the gift of infallibility in relation to Catholic doctrines? I would argue yes. Lumen Gentium 21 on the sacramentality of the episcopate. I would say that it definitively taught that, as would many other theologians. But even if we want to set that to the side and say, okay, well, that wasn't definitively taught, that's somehow up for grabs at this point, at least when it comes to the magisterium reversing it. The question still is, but it did still have teachings in it, right? So what level of assent do those require? At minimum, it would require religious submission of intellect and will. Just as the teachings in a papal encyclical would require religious submission of intellect and will. You're not just free to just say, humani generis, who cares about that? Who cares? Yeah. No, Dr. Marshall would be the first guy to say, oh, no, you got to accept what humani generis says, because even humani generis itself says you got to accept what is in a papal encyclical. Right. Absolutely. Yes. So how much more an ecumenical council that was solemnly ratified by the Pope? Again, notice what he says here. The answer is known by whoever remembers the conciliar declaration repeated on November 1964. Given the council's pastoral character, it avoided pronouncing in an extraordinary manner dogmas endowed with the note of infallibility. Dogmas, not Catholic doctrine. You can teach Catholic doctrine infallibly, and that isn't a dogma. Again, there's a difference between dogma and Catholic doctrine. Primary objects versus secondary objects of infallibility. He's using very technical language. And what happens is, for somebody who doesn't know the technical language and doesn't understand the magisterium, as Dr. Taylor Marshall doesn't, they will read this and think that means then the Second Vatican Council didn't teach anything infallibly. And that's not what he's saying. He's saying it didn't teach any dogmas infallibly. It perhaps taught Catholic doctrines infallibly. He doesn't comment on that here. He just doesn't address it at all. And I would agree, yeah, it doesn't teach any dogmas infallibly, not new ones. But so what? Catholic doctrine has been taught infallibly at the Second Vatican Council. You owe an irrevocable assent to that. That's to be held definitively. And the teachings that are not definitive still require submission of intellect and will. So my question is going to be, does Taylor Marshall accept those teachings, or is he in dissent? Just as the liberals are in dissent when it comes to Pius XII and some of his teachings in Humani Generis, or Paul VI when it comes to Humane Vitae, or John Paul II with some of his teachings, although I think that he taught some matters definitively. But even if you would say, okay, well, he didn't teach the illicitness of women, or the impossibility of women's ordination, although I think he taught that infallibly. If you say, well, he didn't teach that infallibly, I'm going to still ask, but you still assent to what he wrote, right? You still don't agree that women can be ordained, right? if you can now dissent from the Second Vatican Council and its non-definitive teachings, upon what basis can you not now dissent from others? And somebody might say, well, some of those teachings that John Paul II mentioned there are taught definitively by the ordinary and universal magisterium, right? Just as some of the teachings that the Second Vatican Council taught are taught by the ordinary and universal magisterium. Do you give assent to those or not? If not, you are no better than the liberals that he often likes to critique. All right. I want you to notice later on in this article, it quotes Paul VI, making a couple other comments. Notice what it says here. At the end of every document at the Second Vatican Council, look how its teachings are solemnly ratified by the Pope. Each and every one of the things set forth in this document, and then the document is named, has won the consent of the fathers. We too, by the apostolic authority conferred on us by Christ, join with the venerable fathers in approving, decreeing, and establishing these things in the Holy Spirit. And we direct what has been entrusted in synod be published to God's glory. I, Paul, Bishop of the Catholic Church. Now, if you're going to tell me, well, these teachings are somehow up for grabs, which he solemnly ratifies here. If you're going to tell me these teachings are up for grabs, when he is using his apostolic authority that comes from Christ and ratifying them, then your papacy is 100% irrelevant and useless. It's irrelevant and useless. I mean, really, unless your Pope offers a solemn ex cathedra definition, he can be completely against the church in his teachings and what he ratifies. That's your position. Then your papacy is useless. Now, I recognize that yes, there's a extraordinary protection given to solemn papal teachings for sure. But I would still say there's a general protection for non-solemn papal teachings, especially those of an ecumenical council. But if your papacy can accept and teach heresy, as long as it's not ex cathedra, effectively your papacy is useless. Why are you still Catholic? Your bishop there in Rome is really no better than the Patriarch of Constantinople. In fact, Constantinople or the Patriarch of Moscow might have better teachings than your Pope at that point. So why are we bothering with the papacy at this point? All right, well, much more can be said there, but let's continue with the video here by Marshall and get to some of his other comments. Let me move this screen out of the way and we'll resume.
Does Cardinal Cupich enforce the Council of Trent? Does Francis enforce the Council of Trent? What about the Council?
And this is a fair question. It's a fair question. I mean, look, if you're going to enforce the Second Vatican Council, even though I don't believe Cupich is enforcing the Second Vatican Council, some of the things that he wants is actually not what the Second Vatican Council asked for. But even if somehow he were being faithful to the Second Vatican Council, I mean, you also have to be faithful to the Council of Trent, right? You have to be faithful to all of the ecumenical councils, and not just ecumenical councils, but solemn papal teachings, or even non-definitive papal teachings, right? So, I mean, he's right to ask the question. I mean, why do you allegedly try to enforce the Second Vatican Council, but you just chunk seemingly the Council of Trent out the window? It's a fair question. So I'm in agreement with him there. Perhaps Cardinal Cupich is doing that in some ways. Maybe not. We could look further at the issue. But there are definitely plenty of people in the church today who are doing that. They're all about the Second Vatican Council, but they can't tell you anything about the Council of Trent. That's a problem. That's a major problem.
Council of Florence. Can we get heavy on the Council of Florence?
No, with all due respect, why is Marshall bringing up the Council of Florence here? He just disparaged. He just basically sidestepped the Second Vatican Council because it doesn't have any anathemas or canons. But Florence also doesn't have anathemas or canons. Oh, but it has infallible teachings in it. How do you know that? Because it has solemn language in it. Okay. So does the Second Vatican Council. What do you do with that now? If you're going to say there's no definitive teachings at the Second Vatican Council, you would have to say by that same basis, there's no definitive teachings at Florence. Therefore, why are you even bringing up Florence? Who cares then? Now, I do believe there are definitive teachings at Florence, but I believe that with a consistent criteria. The very reasons that allow me to say there are definitive teachings at Florence also allow me to say there are definitive teachings at the Second Vatican Council. They're just not dogmas. They're Catholic doctrine. Even if there were none, you would still have to give religious submission of intellect and will to the Second Vatican Council and to the Council of Florence. If there were no definitive teachings there, you would still have to give that religious submission of intellect and will. So, but why bring up Florence? That's my question. I mean, if he were consistent, he would have to reject Florence. Unless he's willing to say, well, I accept the teachings of the Second Vatican Council. But I've never heard him say that. And what I do see from him saying that Vatican II teaches heresy, which he's explicitly said, would go contrary to that, would go against that. If Vatican II taught heresy, upon what basis can you say that Florence didn't teach heresy when it had no canons and anathemas? And again, if you say, well, it has solemn language in there, and that's the indicator, so does the Second Vatican Council. What do we do now? These are the questions he needs to answer if he wants to be consistent and honest.
Council of Florence says anyone who dies below the age of reason and is not baptized does not receive the beatific vision. Are we going to?
That's false. That is not what Florence says. I sent him my work on this issue, which he claims that he read, so he should know better than this. So I don't think he had any excuses even without me sending that information, but he definitely doesn't have any excuses now. He's culpable for that information and the misinformation that he's disseminating here. That is not what the Council of Florence said. Let's look at what the Council of Florence said. Let me see here. Pull it back up on my screen. If I can get to it. There it is. Okay. There we go. All right. Here's what it does say. But the souls of those who depart in this life in actual sin or original sin alone go straightway to hell to be punished, but with unequal pains. Now let's listen to it one more time so that you can see the distinction here. And it's a very, very important one. It's not minor by any means. Let's listen to it one more time.
Perfect allegiance to a pastoral council that even Paul VI said was not infallible. Does Cardinal Supich enforce the Council of Trent? Does Francis enforce the Council of Trent? What about the Council of Florence? Can we get heavy on the Council of Florence? Council of Florence says anyone who dies below the age of reason and is not baptized does not receive the beatific vision.
Was there any language in here about the age of reason? No, he read that into there. Was there anything in here about them dying unbaptized? No, he's misreading the text, and I'll show you why. I'll show you where he gets that from. Somebody's saying that it's small. Okay, well, let me make it larger. You should be able to see it now, the part that I have highlighted there. Nothing in there about the age of reason, and nothing in there about being baptized. That's crucial, absolutely crucial. Let me explain to you why. We'll read it one more time. But the souls of those who depart in this life in actual mortal sin or in original sin alone go down straightway to hell to be punished, but with unequal pains. He reads into this saying these are people below the age of reason because it's speaking about people with original sin alone. And I would say, yes, you can read it that way. Yeah, because I don't think that there's anybody above the age of reason who has preserved their baptism so perfectly that they've never engaged in any actual sin. Although you'll notice it's comparing only two people in mortal sin versus original sin, not people who would be in a middle category, which would be people who have actual sin, but none of them have been mortal. They've been venial only. Perhaps somebody like Thomas Aquinas, whose first confession, it was noted that he had never committed any mortal sins. So there is a middle category of people there that he's not engaging because, of course, the text doesn't really address it. But I'll still concede the point that, all right, we can talk about people below the age of reason in relation to what's being said here when it speaks about in original sin alone. But you'll notice it never says they're unbaptized. But you might say, well, somebody who's baptized, their original sin has been remitted. Right. Here's the key. It's saying if this person dies in a state of original sin, they go to hell. And of course, limbo is understood as the fringe of hell, the border of hell. And it would be for people who die in a state of original sin alone. What Florence is saying is if somebody dies in a state of original sin, they go to hell, which in this context would be limbo, unequal pains, unequal to those who committed actual and mortal sins. So I would agree that if they die in a state of original sin, they would go to limbo. That's all Florence is saying. Florence is just simply saying, if the person dies in a state of original sin, then they would go to limbo. The limbo, hell, the limbo part, the fringe part of hell. But that's a if, right? It's a conditional statement. If. It's obviously implied. It doesn't necessarily say if the person. It's just simply giving you two different scenarios. A person who dies in a state of original sin or a person who dies in a state of mortal sin. Here's what happens to them. The question is, are there people who don't die in a state of original sin apart from water baptism? Obviously, yes. Our Catholic faith has always taught that. Vatican II dogmatically teaches, Trent dogmatically teaches that that's the case. It's called baptism of desire. Trent dogmatically teaches baptism of desire. So there's already an exception to what Florence is saying. According to the Council of Trent, there are people who don't die in a state of original sin who have never been baptized with water. Their original sin was removed by baptism of desire. So then the question is, okay, is it possible for God to remit an infant's original sin prior to their death apart from water baptism? I mean, if he can do that with adults with baptism of desire, he could do it with an infant. He could. Doesn't mean that we know that he will. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. Maybe some are in limbo, some are in heaven. Maybe all are in limbo. Maybe all are in heaven. Talking about infants here. Maybe all of their original, every infant who's ever died, maybe every one of them had their original sin removed by some extraordinary means. We don't know. All that the post-conciliar church says, and it's rooted even in some pre-conciliar notions, all that it really says is we can have the hope that he does that. We don't have any certainty or guarantee. The infant might be in limbo. The infant might be in heaven. I mean, limbo is not a bad place if that's where they are. It's a place of perfect happiness, natural happiness, and a natural fellowship and communion with God. Not supernatural fellowship, not supernatural happiness, but natural, according to Aquinas. I mean, it's not that bad, right? I mean, the greatest natural happiness that I could ever have and the greatest natural communion that I could ever have with God doesn't sound like a really bad place to me. Now, is that in fact, however, where they go? Maybe, maybe not. The point is, all that Florence is saying is, if they die in that state of original sin, then that's where they go. But the question is, and what we're asking now is, but does that always happen? I mean, it's always going to happen if God doesn't intervene. Everybody contracts original sin. But does God sometimes intervene in the case of an infant and give them the grace of baptism in an extraordinary extra sacramental way? If he does that with adults, which we already know according to the Council of Trent that he does, and that's been a longstanding position of many theologians, doctors of the church, and saints anyway. If he does that with them, why can't he do that with an infant? Well, he can do it with an infant. We just don't know that he does. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. But that's not what Marshall said. He said a person who is below the age of accountability, unless they're baptized, they go to hell. It's not what it said. That's reading into the text just as he read into Paul VI. And the problem is Marshall does this all the time, all over the place. He reads into things and seems to be unable or unwilling to revise some of those things when shown to be wrong, or isn't open to be shown that he's wrong. So he just doesn't hear it. But since he claimed he read my work here, he should know better than that. To so sloppily and in such a consequential way misrepresent the Council of Florence is very, very concerning. So let's finish up here. I think he had a few more comments, and then we'll leave it there. Let me get to the screen. Okay, here we go.
We're going to start enforcing that, lining up the priests and questioning them and asking, do you believe in the Council of Florence?
But again, upon what basis would you believe what Florence taught here, even if you did represent it accurately, which you did not? But let's just pretend that we didn't just see what we saw and somehow Marshall was actually accurately representing Florence. Upon what basis would you expect these post-conciliar priests to assent to the Council of Florence if they used your very own standards? Well, it doesn't have any anathemas, doesn't have any canons, therefore it's up for grabs, right? Therefore it's merely pastoral, right? They could just throw that right back in your face. How do you not see that? The reason why they can't do that is because the non-definitive teachings of Florence required religious submission of intellect and will, and and the definitive teachings would require an irrevocable assent. Somebody says, "Wait, Taylor knows Michael exists?" Yeah, he either watched some of my videos critiquing him, or he at the very least saw it, because he accidentally liked my video critiquing him on this very issue on the Second Vatican Council. He accidentally liked it and then unliked it. So that means he saw at the very least the thumbnail and maybe even watched some of the video, if not all of it. I don't know. But my point was, he's without excuse because, number one, the position that he's in. When you have that much influence over people, you really need to be careful with the information that you give. And then number two, I have already sent him that information on Limbo, and he corresponded with me and let me know that he had read it, but simply doesn't agree because it goes against Aquinas, which that tells me he didn't understand it, because nothing that I said actually went against Aquinas. So that tells me, okay, well, maybe you read it, but it didn't compute, because I agree with Aquinas. I'm not saying anything against Aquinas. That's kind of like the Sensus Fidelium guy. That guy, he asked me to come on his show to talk about my work on Limbo, but then he found out that I was against Limbo, allegedly, that I'm against Limbo, so he canceled the show. And I just simply wrote back to him, I'm not against Limbo, I affirm Limbo. Crickets, no response after that. But of course, so he either didn't bother to look into what I said, or he was just going with what other people were saying. I don't know. But it's just so funny that these guys really don't understand what I'm saying. And maybe it's a lack of clarity on my part, but I don't think that's the case, because other people are understanding what I'm saying. And these are people who don't have degrees in theology. So if they're able to understand me, then a person who has a doctorate, I know it's not in theology, but a person who has a doctorate at the very least should be able to comprehend what I'm saying. I think that they're just not really giving it much thought and really trying to understand where I'm coming from. But that's speculation on my part. But at the very least, he should know better, because I've sent him that information. And even if I've never sent him that information, no, Alex says, Steve could have also just gotten busy. Let's not presume intentions, sir. Well, you need, actually, I need to block you because you don't know what you're talking about. You actually just presumed yourself. I didn't presume any intentions. He told me why he canceled the show. He said it's because you deny Limbo. And I wrote back to him, as I just told you already, and said, no, that is not my position. I affirm Limbo. That's not the position. So I already corrected, that information, and here you are in the chat just disseminating more misinformation. So I don't have patience for that. Those people, this channel is not for you. You might want to go look elsewhere. But again, bringing it back to what I was saying, even if I had never sent that information about Limbo and Florence to Marshall, he should still know better, right? Look, if I was able to find the truth, he's perfectly capable of finding out what Florence actually teaches. All that's required is that you don't have this suspicious attitude of the post-conciliar church. That's all that's really required, is that you don't have evil suspicion, as the Bible calls the sin. That you don't engage in evil suspicion against the post-conciliar church. You give it what's called the judgment of charity. If you do that, you would be able to reconcile these things and see what I'm saying. All right. Well, Absurd Scandal says, so trads are Catholic fundies. Not all. Some are, some aren't. I mean, I'm a traditionalist. I'm not a radical traditionalist. So obviously it's going to be, how are we defining our terms? But I would say there's good traditionalists and there's some bad ones. It just kind of depends on who we're talking about. It's a case by case basis, of course. So, all right, let's finish up.
Here's a checkbox list of Council of Florence things that you need to hold to. Or even, I just love Council of Trent. We could just give it to the Council of Trent. Make people. And if they don't believe, this is kind of an idea here. Ask your Novus Ordo congregations, do you believe in the Council of Trent? And if they're not fully accepting the Council of Trent, which most of them would not be, you say you can only have Novus Ordo if you tend the Latin.
There's nothing new. He hasn't presented anything new there. I've already suggested that. I've already said that Novus Ordo priests, if they do not accept the validity or goodness of the traditional Latin Mass, if they don't accept that, they should not be allowed to be a priest at all. I think that all priests should be and need to be able to affirm the goodness of both forms. And any priest that says, I would refuse to say the Mass, the preconciliar Mass, you need to be disciplined for that. If you're a priest and you would refuse to say the preconciliar Mass, that means you think that there's something wrong or evil with it. And that's a problem. You're in the wrong church. But likewise, if you are a priest who would says the preconciliar Mass and would refuse to say the postconciliar Mass, you likewise need to be disciplined. So I think that both sides should be willing to celebrate liturgies pre and post conciliar. There's nothing new there. I've already said that. I think every Novus Ordo priest should be disciplined if they do not affirm the goodness of the preconciliar liturgy. That doesn't mean that they have to think that everything is ideal about the preconciliar liturgy, because it's not. Just as there's some things in the postconciliar liturgy that are not ideal. But that's a difference between something that's good versus ideal, right? Not evil versus good. If you think the preconciliar liturgy is evil, you need to be disciplined. If you also think that the postconciliar liturgy is evil, you need to be disciplined. Now, we're not talking about abuses in the liturgy. We can all grant that's evil. We're talking about the liturgy objectively considered without abuses. Everybody here agrees liturgical abuses are evil. We all agree with that. But if you think objectively that the postconciliar or preconciliar liturgy objectively is evil, no, you're in the wrong church, and you need to be disciplined for sure. So again, there's nothing new there. I've already said that. Okay, well, I appreciate y'all watching. Let me know your thoughts there in the comment section. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Make sure to hit that like button. Share this on your social media so that others will know about this and help the channel grow. Also, finally, I want to ask that you would consider supporting us on Patreon, patreon.com/Reason in Theology. If you want to support what we're doing here so we can continue to offer this information. All right, well, that's going to do it. We'll see y'all later. Till next time. God bless.